All right, so in this video, we are talking about budgets. On the front side of these notes that you will have found in Teams, it explains many things, one of which is the difference between fixed and variable expenses. So just to recap quickly, fixed expenses are expenses that are predictable. They are the same from month to month for the most part. We talked about how there's a little bit of an exception to that. So fixed is predictable. It's the same from month to month. And the exception sometimes is things like your phone bill. Your phone bill is the same every month for the most part, but occasionally you might go over your data a little bit, which might change your bill. But for the most part, you signed a contract, you are paying a certain amount every month for the next 2 years. So that's what makes it a fixed expense. Things like your mortgages or your rent, those are going to be fixed expenses because they are the same amount every month. Variable expenses are expenses that change from month to month. So things like your food budget. The amount that you spend on food will likely change from month to month. Even if you buy pretty much the exact same thing every month, price of food changes, right? Something might be on sale one week, not the next. So your budget for food is going to vary a little bit from month to month. So variable expenses, fixed expenses. Variable expenses, understandably, vary a little from month to month, and a fixed expense is the set amount every month. It is predictable. And then, like I said, there's a little bit of gray area with certain things, but for the most part, it is very clearly either variable or fixed. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to go through this example, and we are going to say, just to start, to say if it's fixed or variable. So we're looking over here at Tom's planned expenses. So Tom's planned expenses were $550 for rent. Rent would be considered a fixed expense. Sorry. So rent would be considered a fixed expense. $235 for a car payment. That is also going to be a fixed expense because it is $235 every month for that car payment. $85 for car insurance, same thing. That is a fixed expense. Occasionally, if you get into an accident, they do something called upping your premium, which means you might pay more each month, but that usually only comes into an effect the next year when you renew your car insurance. So it often won't come into effect until the next year, and then it's going to be the same amount every month for that next year. So no matter what, it is going to be a fixed expense. The next amount that's listed here is $340 for food. That would be a variable expense because, like I said, it could change a little bit each month. $65 for utilities. That is a variable expense. Utilities means things like your power and your water. With NB Power, there is something called, oh gosh, what's it called? It was gone from my brain as soon as I started to say it. This happened this morning too. Equalized billing. Sorry. So there's something called equalized billing where you can agree with NB Power that you're going to pay a certain amount every month for the entire year, which might make people think this can be fixed. But your water bill is something that you get every 3 months. And when we say utilities, we usually mean both together. So I'm going to argue that it's variable for sure because the water bill is only every 3 months. I'm also going to argue that it's variable because even with equalized billing, at the end of the year, if you didn't pay enough, so even if you guys decided you're going to pay $300 every month, if you used more power than $300 every month, at the end of that year, NB Power makes you pay the difference. Or even if you paid less, they'll give you a credit. So it's still variable because the amount of power that you use every month changes. So, and NB Power changes their rate sometimes too, right? So you want to make sure that that is variable, even if you are someone who does something like equalized billing, because you're not using the same amount of power, and what they charge for power could be. So that is still a variable expense. $75 for clothing, that is a variable expense. You do not buy clothing every month necessarily, and if you do, you're probably not spending $75 unless it's something like a uniform, and then hopefully it is not costing you $75 every month. Entertainment, that's something that's going to vary from month to month. $100 for savings. This presumably means that they are setting aside $100 every month regardless. So you could save different amounts each month, certainly, but this presumably means that they have decided that they are putting aside $100 every month, so it is a fixed expense. $40 for gas, that is a variable expense. Even if you think that you drive the same amount every month and you never make any detours or anything, that's still going to be variable because the price of gas changes all the time. So $40 for personal and household items, that is variable. You likely won't spend the same amount on personal items from month to month. $60 for phone, as I explained, that is fixed because it is presumably $60 most months unless you happen to go over your data, but it is still a predictable expense, so $60. $25 for cable. I wish cable was only $25, but that is also a fixed expense. $120 for student loan. I also wish that my student loan payments were only $120, but they are not. Anyway, that is also a fixed expense. And then last but not least, it tells us income. So notice that says bi-weekly income. We are looking at a monthly budget. Now, depending on if you work or how long you've been working, you might notice that if you're paid bi-weekly, that means every 2 weeks. Occasionally, the occasional month, you end up with like 3 payments a month. Most months, though, because you're paid every 2 weeks, you're going to have 2 payments a month. So when we are looking at this person's income, we are going to assume they were paid twice that month. So just know it could change a little bit, but we are going to assume that they were paid twice that month. So we're going to start to fill in this chart here now, where we actually break down their expenses and look at the budget. So the first thing I'm going to do, because they are paid bi-weekly, I'm going to say that that is 1,026. And you could do this 2 ways. You could say 1,026 times 2, or you can write it like this and actually write out the 2 times they were presumably paid that month. So 1,026 plus 1,026, which gives you a total of 2,052 for that month. So that's their total income for the month, presumably. Then we're going to look at their fixed expenses. There's quite a few fixed expenses, so I'm going to kind of cram some of these into like 2 things in one slot. The first fixed expense that we looked at is rent. And the nice thing about classifying them as all fixed and variable first is you can actually, fixed will always come to the top of your budget. So now that we've classified them, you can just look for all the ones with F that are written in first. So the first thing is rent, and that was $550 for rent. So $550 for rent. The next thing was car payment. So the car payment was $235. The next thing was car insurance. And that was $85 a month. The next thing was savings. My writing is really bad. Savings was $100 a month. The next one was phone. So the phone bill is $60 a month. I wish. Cable. The cable bill is $25 a month. And then student loan. The student loan payment was $120. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to total up the fixed expenses. So you would take your calculator out at this point and you would add up all of the fixed expenses. And when you do that, and you can pause the video if you want to do that for yourself to make sure we get the same numbers, I would suggest that. When you add all of those up, you get 1,175. So you'll see there's a couple reasons why totaling the fixed expenses now is useful. We'll talk about that after. So 1,175 for fixed expenses. Now for variable, we said food was a variable expense, and this particular month they spent $340 on food. The next one was utilities. That is a variable expense. It's one of the ones that people could argue, but I'm going to say it is a variable expense. It is $65. Clothes. They spent $75 that month on clothes. Entertainment. They spent $50 that month on entertainment. Gas. They spent $40 on gas that month. They must drive a Prius like me. And then personal. Personal and household items was $40. And then again, we are going to total up the variable expenses. So you can pause the video here to make sure you get the same amount. When you total up the variable expenses, you should get $610. Then your total expenses, so now that you've totaled each thing, the variable and the fixed, finding your total expenses is actually a little easier because you can just take those two totals and add it together. Now, that's not the only reason we do this, it's just one of the advantages. So you take your two totals for your fixed and your variable, you add them together, and you get 1,785. And I just feel that there's less room for error if you do it this way. And then your balance, so you spent a total of $1,785 that month. The balance is you take your income, so the 2,052, and you subtract what you spent. And when you take 2,052 and you subtract 1,785, you get a balance of positive $267. Now it might seem weird to write that positive. The reason we do that is because you always want your balance to be positive or zero. You never want it to be negative. So if ever you get that you spent more than what you make, I do want you to put a negative in front there, which is why we're going to put a positive as well, just to remind ourselves that they didn't spend more than what they made that month. Now, the other reason I got you to do your totals is we're going to find the percent of income. Now, this question, this worksheet, if you read a little further, technically wanted you to find the percent of income for every single expense. I'm not interested in that. We are going to look at the total. So we're going to take the total fixed expense and we're going to find out what percent of their income is being spent on fixed expenses. So we take that total of 1,175 and we divide it by their total income, 2,052. You will get a decimal. You times that decimal by 100 and it turns it into a percent. So when you do 1,175 divided by 2,052, you get 0.5726. You times that by 100 and you get 57.3%. And then we're going to do the same thing for variable. So 610 divided by 2,052. You get 0.2972 times by 100, and you get 29.7%. And that's it. So you're going to repeat this process for example number 2. For those of you who are following along with your handouts, this Tom's budget was the front side of the page. Your space to do Marcia's budget is on the back side of the page, and you will just use the information there. I suggest you separate the expenses into fixed and variable first, and then you put it into a chart and just follow the exact same thing that we did. Okay? Hope that makes sense.